Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Dr. Carl James, and I'm the Head of Military History here at the Australian War Memorial. It is my great pleasure to welcome you this morning and for the launch of this new publication by Dr. Peter Ewell, The Long Shadow, Australia's Vietnam Veterans Since the War. I'd like to begin this morning by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land on which we meet, the Ngunnawal people, and to also acknowledge the custodians of the land on which you're meeting today. Now, whilst it is unfortunate that we are unable to launch this significant publication to a larger audience, I'd like to acknowledge the following guests joining us today. Major General Murray Thompson, representing the Chief of the Defence Force. Mr. Don Spinks, the Repatriation Commissioner of the Department of Veterans Affairs. Mr. Bill Roberts, National President of the Vietnam Veterans Federation of Australia. Mr. Graham Walker, National Researcher of the Vietnam Veterans Federation of Australia. Mr. Salvatore Vittio, New South Wales President of the Vietnam Veterans Association of Australia. Lieutenant Colonel Simon Herder, ACT President of the Australian Army Training Team Vietnam. Dr. Michael Fett, the Project Epidemiologist. Wing Commander Sharon Bown, representing the Chairman of the Council of the Australian War Memorial. And we especially acknowledge and welcome the Vietnam veterans who are here in attendance this morning. Our guest speakers are unable to physically join us today. However, they have sent messages of support. Shortly, we will hear from the Honourable Darren Chester, Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel. The Honourable Graham Edwards, Vietnam War veteran and former Australian War Memorial Council member. And finally, we will hear from the book's author, Dr. Peter Ewell. But first, I'd like to welcome Mr. Matt Anderson, Director of the Australian War Memorial, to commence proceedings.
Good morning and welcome to the Australian War Memorial. I too would like to extend my acknowledgement of the Ngunnawal people, the traditional custodians of the land on which we gather, and pay my respects to their elders past and present. Today is a very important day for Vietnam veterans. For all veterans, and indeed for those currently serving in the Australian Defence Force. As Director, and on behalf of the Council, and again I welcome Council Member Wing Commander Sharon Bown today, on behalf of the Council, to welcome you for this launch of The Long Shadow, Australia's Vietnam Veterans Since the War. Dr. Yule agreed that there was no more time to wait. We couldn't wait for restrictions to be lifted in Victoria for Dr. Yule to travel to Canberra to allow this launch to go ahead. As the veterans in the room know and the veterans online know, you've waited long enough. 50 years is long enough. The idea to research and write a book about the medical legacy suffered by veterans during the Vietnam War was initially pursued by the previous director, Dr. Brendan Nelson, as ever a visionary and a leader, a thought leader, and it enjoyed strong support from the Memorials Council under Chairman Rear Admiral Ken Doolan. Under Admiral Doolan, he listened keenly to the veterans who had challenged the findings of the medical volume of the official history of Vietnam, and in particular, the health experiences that you had all suffered, and that importantly that you continued to face. Former council member and Vietnam veteran, who you'll hear from shortly, the Honourable Graham Edwards was a staunch advocate for the need for an independent history to be written. So many years on, to correct the misperceptions that Vietnam veterans experiences and to actively contribute to a body of evidence, to shape the narrative, to change people's minds and to change people's views. A scoping study was commissioned back in 2015. Again, this has been a while in coming. Council steadfastly endorsed this 4-year proposal to write this independent history and to examine the development of a range of medical issues experienced by our veterans. Your physical wounds, your exposure to herbicides and other chemicals, and of course, post-traumatic stress disorder. Such a significant undertaking over 4 years needed funding. It doesn't happen without the money. And we also needed a well-credentialed author to bring this idea into fruition. The funding was forthcoming through a bequest to the Australian War Memorial through the estate of the late Bruce Rivers Ellis. Mr. Ellis honours Vietnam veterans through his contribution, and we thank him for his legacy, and we also thank the surviving members of his family for this wonderful gift. Dr. Yule, of course, was the perfect choice for this project. He delivered it on time and he delivered it on budget. This isn't a Send Estimates hearing, by the way, but he delivered it on time and on budget. And I believe he's honoured you, the veterans, in producing a thorough and a well-researched book. But it couldn't and wouldn't have been possible without his genuine empathy for the experience of the Vietnam veterans since your return home. Here at the Australian War Memorial, we try to explore the causes, the conduct, and the aftermath, or the consequences of war and the Australian experience of war. This critical, important story greatly adds to our understanding of the aftermath of your service in the Vietnam War. For 50 years, this has been a long journey, too long. And as Graham's own interview suggests when captured for this book, he says that, for me, Vietnam is no longer a war, it is a country. But for many veterans, Vietnam is still a war. It was the memorial's intention to record, summarise and interpret the medical issues as told by Vietnam veterans, past government officials, through interviews and as reported in medical studies, medical journals and research. I believe that he's done that, and he's done it well, but more importantly, don't take it from me, take it from another Vietnam veteran, former Governor-General, former Chief of the Defence Force, and the man who provided the foreword to this book, Sir Peter Cosgrove, General Sir Peter Cosgrove, who unfortunately couldn't be here today, and indeed who launched his own book just yesterday in Sydney. The long shadow, he said, helps us to understand veterans, their loved ones, veterans supporting agencies, and the wider community about the effects of a war like Vietnam, embraced by the veterans as part of their duty at the time and endured by them for the rest of their lives in its aftermath. Before closing, I would like to pay particular mention of Mr. Tim McComb, OAM, who passed away in January 2015. Tim, amongst other Vietnam veterans, started this journey that concludes today with this volume. Unfortunately, he wasn't here and unable to be here to see it through. He campaigned actively for many years, and he and the many Vietnam veterans who are no longer with us, their legacy is in this book. So I'm honoured to be here in your company today and to be part of this chapter in your story. But it is my genuine hope that through the understanding of the consequences of your service as veterans, that we apply that lesson to today's veterans and to all who serve in your wake. Because if we apply the lessons that you have learned as veterans to today's veterans, your service and your sacrifice in Phuoc Tuy and in the 50 years since will not have been in vain. So thank you.
Thank you, Director. We will now hear a message from the Honourable Darren Chester, Minister for Veterans Affairs and Minister for Defence Personnel.
I would first like to acknowledge the Vietnam veterans who are joining us today and say simply, thank you for your service. The long shadow, Australia's Vietnam veterans since the war, touches on an important part of our history and one that should never be forgotten. In 1962, the Commonwealth Government committed the Australian Army Training Team to South Vietnam. This was the beginning of our involvement in the Vietnam War. In May 1965, this commitment expanded to a full battalion, and in June of the same year, the first national servicemen were being called up. Australia's involvement in Vietnam and conscription were incredibly politically and socially divisive. There's no denying that the Vietnam War had a profound impact on Australia and on the men and women who fought in it. There was early public support in Australia for involvement in the war, and returning battalions were warmly welcomed home and they were celebrated. Over the years, though, the public mood and support for the war changed, and eventually it became extremely unpopular. Returning Vietnam veterans had different experiences. Some had public parades and marches through capital cities. However, some veterans came back to an uncertain welcome, feeling ostracised by civilians. Each veteran's experience is unique and coloured by many factors. No one veteran can speak for all. However, the psychological and physical effects of service in Vietnam affected many veterans. Vietnam veterans were the champions of mental health support. They were vital in the establishment of the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service, now known as Open Arms Veterans and Families Counselling. Today, Open Arms is Australia's leading national provider of high-quality mental health counselling and support for all Australian veterans and for their families. Open Arms is a life-saving service that provides free and confidential counselling, group treatment programs, suicide prevention training, and a community and peer network to support the mental health and well-being in the ex-service community. Last year, Open Arms supported 30,000 veterans and their family members, and this is all thanks to our Vietnam veterans. The Long Shadow, Australia's Vietnam Veterans Since the War, continues to highlight the impacts of the war and, importantly, gives a voice to veterans who lived through it. I would like to congratulate Dr. Peter Ewell and the team from the Australian War Memorial. Through works such as this, current and future generations will never forget the service and the sacrifice of those who fought in the Vietnam War, lest we forget.
Thank you, Minister Chester. As a Vietnam veteran wounded twice during his service, Graham Edwards knows firsthand the trauma of war. Throughout his career in the military, public service, and in the Parliament of Western Australia, his dedication, service, and extensive contribution to the veteran community and disability welfare is to be commended. We will now hear from the Honourable Graham Edwards, who will officially launch the Long Shadow.
Good morning all, distinguished guests. Thank you for the invitation and the opportunity to be involved in the launch of this historic book. As an office employee in the Vietnam Veterans Counselling Service in Perth, I saw on a daily basis veterans presenting to the service looking for some understanding as to the emotions they were experiencing and why. I also came to the conclusion, as a survivor of a landmine explosion in Vietnam, although having lost my legs, that I was more fortunate than most people who were presenting, in that my wounds were clearly visible, acceptable and understandable. I was seeing with the veterans presenting and their families an incredible devastation, an incredible lack of understanding of these emotions. And I realised then that perhaps the hidden wounds of war were more damaging, more difficult to deal with than visible wounds of war. And that brings me to the launch of this work by Peter Ewell, this incredible work. An authentic work which has focused on these troubled times, and a work that has been crafted with compassion, care, consideration, eloquence, and above all, understanding. Crucially, Peter has based much of his analytical work through discussions with dozens of veterans whose wartime experiences were accepted as credible, authentic, and treated with respect and genuine care. But Peter is also coldly precise and forensic in his examination of the Royal Commission, which favoured Monsanto and their bevy of highly paid Clayton Utz lawyers who were pitted against the under-resourced but deserving case put forward by volunteers of the Vietnam Veterans Association and their understaffed team, who were, in my view, so unjustly treated by counsel assisting the Royal Commission. However, if Peter is forensic in his exposing the bias of the Royal Commission, he is even more clinical as he tears asunder and rips to shreds Volume 3 of the Official History written by academic historian F.B. Smith. But before I go further into that, I would like to recount the reason that Peter's work was commissioned in the first place. I spoke to Graham Walker, a man I much admire and a man with great standing in the veteran community. Graham reminded me of these points, and I quote, "There is a story about why this book was written. In the late 1970s, the Vietnam veteran movement began a campaign for a Royal Commission into the effects of their exposure to herbicides, including Agent Orange, and insecticides whilst on war service in Vietnam. In 1983, the Royal Commission was established. The Royal Commission made findings under two separate standards of proof. One, at the civil court standard of proof, and the other under repatriation law, which requires giving veterans the benefit of the doubt. At civil court standard, the verdict was Agent Orange, not guilty. In 1994, Volume 3 of the Official History was published. It included a section on the Agent Orange controversy. The author, academic F.B. Smith, in a shockingly flawed account, claimed the veterans had no claim and that they were motivated by greed. Smith's claim that the veterans were motivated by greed was ludicrous. If he had bothered to interview any of them, he would have realised that they were in the best Anzac tradition, fighting for a fair treatment for their brothers in arms. In amongst many other flaws, F.B. Smith failed to mention that the Royal Commission castigated the Department of Veterans Affairs for purposefully finding ways round obeying repatriation law. Outraged by this shocking wrong account, the veterans began a campaign for the official history to be rewritten. It was during this time that I came on to the Council of the Australian War Memorial and was able to give support to that campaign. But it needs to be said that without the enduring commitment of the Vietnam Veterans Federation President Tim McComb and Graham Walker, that the probability is that this account we are launching this morning would never have been written. It also needs to be said that with the appointment of Brendan Nelson as a director of the Australian War Memorial, that the attitude changed more sympathetically to listening to those who are voicing their concerns. Peter, I believe that through the long shadow, you have delivered healing and vindication to the Vietnam veteran community, their families, and in particular to some of our early Vietnam veteran leaders and advocates. You recognise the incredible work of the late Tim McComb in the way that he tenaciously pursued veterans' claims, winning many. I believe too you have reinstated honour and integrity to a former friend, mentor and champion of the Vietnam veterans community, the late Phil Thompson. Phil was unfairly targeted, denigrated and maligned in Smith's volume, and I quote from The Long Shadow where you said this: "Even more serious is the allegation that Smith made about Phil Thompson. Phil served 2 tours, was wounded at Coral and discharged after being diagnosed with cancer. Smith made no mention of Thompson's war service or the fact that he was later awarded an OAM in recognition for his work for veterans, but gratuitously claimed that he was receiving irregularly augmented repatriation benefits. It is almost unbelievable that an official history could denigrate a veteran with no supporting evidence and attempt to disguise a lack of evidence by giving misleading references. End of quote. I just simply say rest in peace, Tim. Rest in peace, Phil. Your duty was well done. In conclusion, I want to say this, Peter, that your work will stand the test of time and will last as an enduring, accurate, true historic account of the post-war trials and challenges of Vietnam veterans and their families. Your book, Peter, is compelling, comprehensive, compassionate, sensitive and healing. I thank you, Peter, and your team for your work, and it's now with a great deal of pleasure that I officially launch The Long Shadow. Thank you.
As a Research Fellow of the School of Historical and Philosophical Studies at the University of Melbourne, Dr. Peter Ewell has published over 20 books on Australian military, medical and economic history, including histories of the Collins-class submarine project, Australian National Airways, and the Royal Children's Hospital in Melbourne. It is now my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Peter Ewell to discuss his latest publication, The Long Shadow.
Vietnam veterans, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. My apologies to the distinguished guests, but today the Vietnam veterans come first. A question that some of you might ask is, why did the War Memorial commission a history of the post-war experiences of Vietnam veterans when this did not happen for veterans of Australia's earlier wars? The short answer is because Vietnam was different. Wars have always had a lasting effect on the lives of those who have fought in them, but never before have the medical legacies of war been the subject of public and controversial debate in the same way as Vietnam. The nature of a guerrilla war, where it is impossible to tell friend from foe, the futility of the war and the ultimate defeat, the rejection of veterans on their return, the Agent Orange controversy, and the better understanding of PTSD, all made the post-war experience of Vietnam veterans very different from those of veterans of Australia's earlier wars. It took several decades for governments, DVA and the medical profession to understand that Vietnam was different and that Vietnam veterans faced different challenges than veterans of earlier wars. The commissioning of this book by the War Memorial Council was a recognition of the legitimacy of Vietnam veterans' claims that their post-war experiences had been uniquely challenging and also widely misunderstood. I'm grateful to the then Director of the War Memorial, Dr. Brendan Nelson, the Chairman of the Memorial Council, Kerry Stokes, and all members of the Council for commissioning me to write this history. Their only request was to ensure that the voices of the veterans are heard. I can state categorically that they have kept to their undertaking that the history would be independent. No members of the Council or the War Memorial staff attempted to influence my findings in any way. The conclusions, right or wrong, are mine alone, based on my appraisal of the evidence. I don't expect that all my conclusions will be welcomed or accepted by all veterans, but I trust that they will believe that they were arrived at honestly. I owe thanks to many people for their help and support while researching and writing this book. My greatest debt is to the veterans and veterans' families who were interviewed for this project. Their experiences and views varied greatly, but they spoke bravely and honestly about the war and its impact on their lives. They had done what their country asked of them, and many have suffered lifelong consequences as a result. I also want to acknowledge those veterans and their family members whose voices cannot be heard. Far too many Vietnam veterans have died prematurely. Many people helped with this project, and it is invidious to single out individuals, but some do deserve particular acknowledgement. Graham Walker first contacted me on the day the project was announced, and he has since provided me with a vast amount of material to ensure that I was given a complete picture of the history of veterans' health concerns. He will doubtless also be the first to recognise any weaknesses in my arguments. Many other past and present leaders of veterans organisations have given the project great support, including Ken Foster, Max Ball, the late Peter Ryan, and the late Tim McComb. I owe special thanks to Bernie's Appeal, Gary and Sandra Adams, and the late Holt McMinn for helping me understand the early years of the Vietnam Veterans Association. Tutu veteran Walter Pearson went above and beyond during the Vietnam study trip he led in 2019. The cover photo, which shows one of the many abortive attempts to clear the Long High Hills, was inspired by this visit when I saw how the long shadow of the Long High Hills dominates so much of southern Phuoc Tuy province. I also learned a great deal from conversations over many years with Tom Good, the first Vietnam veteran I ever met, which was back in the 1970s, so aptly named by Lachlan Irvine as the Decade of Silence. Dr. Michael Fett read and analysed hundreds of medical and scientific publications and helped me make sense of the vast number of studies of the health of Vietnam veterans. The project would have been almost impossible without his contribution. Thank you again, Michael. Similarly, I thank the 4 historians who carried out interviews with Vietnam veterans all around Australia. They performed their task with skill and sensitivity. The staff, past and present, of the War Memorial and the Department of Veterans Affairs have been unfailingly helpful, as have the staff in the many libraries and archives whose collections were used in researching this book. I'd particularly like to thank Anne Benny for her support of the project and Ashley Eakins for sharing his vast knowledge of the Vietnam War. My final thanks go to Craig Tibbetts, the research project manager. Without Craig's hard work and calm efficiency, this project would never have been completed. Thank you, Craig. The official cost to Australia of the Vietnam War between 1962 and 1972 was $218 million. At today's prices, this using the Reserve Bank's inflation calculator, that's about $2.6 billion. The cost of caring for those who served in the war is already many times more than the cost of fighting the war, and the costs will continue for many years to come. In the financial year ending 30 June 2018, the cost of disability and medical treatment, disability pensions and medical treatment for Vietnam veterans came to about $2 billion. In financial terms, the cost of the Vietnam War to Australia will end up being well over $100 billion, and that takes no account of the continuing human cost that cannot be measured in monetary terms. Australia's repatriation system was designed to be generous. This has always been the intention of Parliament, prompted by the near universal agreement of the Australian people that those who are sent to fight in their name should be cared for on their return. The generous intent has sometimes been lost in the maze of government bureaucracy or ignored by those concerned at the cost of generosity. But if we cannot afford to be generous to servicemen and women who return damaged by war, whose lives will never be the same again, then it is utterly wrong to send them to fight in civil wars in distant lands when there is no direct threat to Australia. The experience of Vietnam shows that a large majority of soldiers return home from war service permanently damaged. The cost of caring for them must be factored into politicians' calculations when they choose to send our armed forces to fight in wars for the frequently questionable foreign policy aims of our allies. The only way to avoid war trauma, with its enormous human and monetary cost, is to avoid wars. I've learned a great deal during this project. Most of all, I've learned to admire and respect the quiet courage of Vietnam veterans and their families. Many veterans believe their service and sacrifice have never been fully recognised and that their health problems have been ignored, trivialised or denied altogether. My hope is that this book will help to ensure that their voices are heard. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Ewell. And congratulations on this publication. It's a significant achievement. I now invite Mr. Matt Anderson to return to the lectern to say a few words.
Well, I really wanted just to thank those who were beamed into us, from Graham, Peter and the Minister for lending their voice and their support and endorsement to this volume. Everything we do here at the War Memorial starts with Charles Bean, and for those who know, in his study when he died, one of the books that was in the study was a battlefield guide, basically, that he had collected when he went on his first battlefield tour with his family to Waterloo. And it was called The Voices from Waterloo. And in the front of it was a little inscription, and it just said, "Facts are stubborn things." I think that guided his life. It certainly guides my hand here at the Australian War Memorial. What I want to assure, and what I'm so reassured by, is the fact that this volume allows facts to be aired. It allows misperceptions to be addressed and wrongs to be righted. So at the Australian War Memorial, facts are stubborn things. This will take pride of place on my bookshelf, and I hope on the bookshelf of anyone who seeks a greater understanding of the consequences of service. But to the veterans here today, I just want you to know this is your home, and here we will guard your record and tell your stories.
Thank you, Director. Ladies and gentlemen, that concludes the official launch of The Long Shadow. For those of you watching this remotely, please note that The Long Shadow is available for purchase online from the Memorial Shop. It has been a great pleasure and privilege to host this very special event for you all today, and I hope that we can welcome you to the Memorial in person very, very soon. This morning's launch has been recorded and will be made available on the Memorial's YouTube channel. The photographs captured today can be viewed on the Memorial's Flickr page. Thank you, and please enjoy the rest of your day.